Welcome to our journey through 25 key moments that shaped American history. From the earliest voyages of exploration to groundbreaking moments of change and progress, these events have defined the United States and its place in the world. Join us as we delve into these pivotal moments and explore the people, decisions, and legacies that have left an indelible mark on the course of American history. Let's begin. Number 1. The discovery of the Americas, 1492. In 1492, a bold voyage set in motion the transformation of the world. Christopher Columbus, an explorer sponsored by Spain, set sail westward across the Atlantic in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he landed on an island in the Caribbean, mistakenly believing he had found the outskirts of Asia. This moment would mark the beginning of European exploration and colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Though Columbus's journey is often celebrated as a daring feat of exploration, it also signaled the beginning of a darker chapter. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas brought devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. The Columbian Exchange, which saw the transfer of crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New, reshaped global economies, but also led to the destruction of indigenous populations through disease and conquest. The discovery of the Americas set off a wave of exploration by European powers, Spain, Portugal, France, and Britain, forever changing the political and cultural landscape of the New World. It was a pivotal moment that laid the foundation for the colonization of the Americas and ultimately the birth of the United States. Number 2. The Founding of Jamestown, 1607. In the year 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America was established at Jamestown, Virginia. Funded by the Virginia Company of London, the settlers hoped to find gold and other resources to enrich England. However, the reality of life in Jamestown was far harsher than they expected. Disease, hunger, and conflicts with the local Powhatan Confederacy nearly wiped out the colony in its early years. Under the leadership of Captain John Smith, the settlers endured, and the colony began to stabilize. But it wasn't until the cultivation of tobacco, introduced by John Rolfe, that Jamestown became economically viable. Tobacco quickly became Virginia's cash crop, and its success would lead to the expansion of the plantation economy and the introduction of African slavery to the colony in 1619. Jamestown's survival marked a critical step in the establishment of British colonies in North America, and its legacy shaped the development of future settlements. It was a symbol of resilience, yet it also foreshadowed the complex and often troubling history of colonization, labor, and race relations that would define much of early American history. Number 3. The Mayflower Compact, 1620. In 1620, the Mayflower, carrying a group of pilgrims seeking religious freedom, landed far north of its intended destination in Virginia, eventually arriving on the shores of what is now Massachusetts. Realizing they were outside the jurisdiction of English law, the pilgrims knew they needed to establish a form of government to ensure order and cooperation among the settlers. On November 11, 1620, before stepping off the ship, the men aboard the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact, a brief document that established a basic form of self-government based on majority rule. The compact was a significant step toward democracy, representing the first written framework for government in what would become the United States. Though the Pilgrims faced harsh winters and struggled to survive in the new land, the Plymouth colony they established became a lasting symbol of religious freedom and self-governance. The Mayflower Compact laid the groundwork for the democratic principles that would later take root in the American colonies and inspire future generations in the quest for liberty and justice. Number 4. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. On a cold December evening in 1773, a group of American colonists staged a dramatic protest that would help spark the American Revolution. Frustrated by British taxation policies, including the infamous Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, colonists in Boston took matters into their own hands. Dressed as Mohawk Indians to disguise their identities, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was a bold act of defiance against British rule, symbolizing the growing unrest in the colonies over taxation without representation. The British government's harsh response, known as the Coercive Acts or Intolerable Acts, only further inflamed tensions, leading to greater unity among the colonies and setting the stage for the American Revolution. The Boston Tea Party remains an enduring symbol of the fight for American independence and the rejection of oppressive governance. Number 5. The Declaration of Independence, 1776. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was officially adopted by the Second Continental Congress, marking the birth of a new nation. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the document was a bold statement declaring the colony's independence from Britain and laying out the philosophical foundations of American democracy. The Declaration famously proclaims that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words, though not fully realized at the time, have become the cornerstone of American ideals. The document listed the grievances against King George III and justified the colony's right to break away from British rule. It was a revolutionary act of defiance that sparked the American Revolution and inspired other movements for independence around the world. The Declaration of Independence remains one of the most significant and enduring documents in history, symbolizing the principles of freedom and equality that continue to guide the nation. Number 6. The Constitutional Convention, 1787. In the summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia with the monumental task of creating a new government. The United States had won its independence from Britain, but the Articles of Confederation, which governed the nation, had proven too weak to effectively manage the country's growing needs. The result of the delegates' work was the U.S. Constitution, a document that would establish the framework of the government that still exists today. Led by figures like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, the delegates debated key issues, including the balance of power between large and small states and the role of the executive branch. The Great Compromise led to the creation of a bicameral legislature, with the Senate providing equal representation for each state and the House of Representatives based on population. The Constitution created a system of checks and balances among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, ensuring that no single branch could dominate. It also allowed for amendments, providing flexibility as the nation evolved. Though the document was ratified in 1788, it was only after the addition of the Bill of Rights in 1791 that the Constitution truly became a symbol of American liberty, protecting individual freedoms like speech, religion, and the press. Number 7. The Bill of Rights, 1791. In December 1791, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, was ratified, marking a pivotal moment in the protection of individual liberties in America. The Bill of Rights was drafted in response to demands from anti-federalists, who feared that the new Constitution granted too much power to the federal government and did not do enough to safeguard the rights of individuals and states. Led by James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights was created to address these concerns. It outlines specific prohibitions on governmental power and guarantees fundamental rights to American citizens. These amendments have become some of the most cherished principles in American democracy. The First Amendment guarantees freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. These freedoms form the backbone of American civic life, ensuring that individuals can express themselves without fear of government repression. Other amendments within the Bill of Rights are equally significant. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms, while the Fourth Amendment guards against unreasonable searches and seizures, laying the foundation for privacy rights. The Fifth Amendment guarantees the right to due process, ensuring that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without legal procedures. The Bill of Rights didn't just enhance the Constitution, it became a living symbol of America's commitment to liberty and justice for all. Number 8. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803. In 1803, the United States, under the leadership of President Thomas Jefferson, secured the Louisiana Purchase, a land deal that would forever change the future of the nation. For a mere $15 million, the U.S. acquired approximately 828,000 square miles of territory from France, doubling the size of the country and opening up vast new lands for exploration and settlement. At the time, the Louisiana territories stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. The purchase was a diplomatic and economic triumph for Jefferson, who saw the acquisition as vital to the expansion of the agrarian republic he envisioned. Control of the Mississippi River and the strategic port of New Orleans was especially important for trade and agriculture, as it gave American farmers a direct route to export their goods. However, the purchase was not without controversy. Jefferson, a strict interpreter of the Constitution, struggled with the fact that there was no clear constitutional authority for acquiring new territory. Additionally, the expansion into the West raised tensions over the extension of slavery, an issue that would continue to divide the nation for decades. Despite these challenges, the Louisiana Purchase was a transformative moment in American history, solidifying the United States' status as an emerging continental power and setting the stage for the nation's westward expansion. It was a bold move that doubled the size of the nation and embodied the growing ambition of the young republic. 9. The War of 1812, 1812 to 1815. The War of 1812 was a defining conflict between the United States and Great Britain, often referred to as America's Second War of Independence. The war erupted in 1812 as tensions boiled over due to British interference with American trade, the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy, and Britain's support for Native American resistance against American westward expansion. President James Madison declared war in June 1812, despite a divided Congress and an unprepared military. The war saw key battles across North America, from the burning of Washington, D.C. by British forces in 1814 to the defense of Fort McHenry, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem that would become the Star-Spangled Banner. One of the war's most famous engagements came after the peace treaty was signed, the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, where General Andrew Jackson led American forces to a decisive victory over the British. For many Americans, the War of 1812 represented the final chapter in the nation's struggle to define itself as a sovereign power on the global stage. Number 10. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823. In 1823, President James Monroe introduced a bold new policy that would define U.S. foreign relations in the Western Hemisphere for generations, the Monroe Doctrine. In his annual message to Congress, Monroe declared that the American continents were no longer open to European colonization, and any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of nations in the Western Hemisphere would be seen as a threat to US interests. The doctrine was crafted in response to growing concerns that European powers, particularly Spain and France, might try to reassert control over newly independent nations in Latin America. Monroe's statement reflected a desire to protect these nations from European domination, while also asserting America's role as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. At its core, the Monroe Doctrine signaled a shift in US foreign policy toward a more assertive stance in regional affairs. While it had little immediate impact due to the United States' relatively limited military power at the time, the doctrine became a cornerstone of US policy in the Western Hemisphere, guiding actions in future decades, including interventions in Latin America and the eventual construction of the Panama Canal. The Monroe Doctrine laid the groundwork for America's emergence as a global power and sent a clear message to the world. The Western Hemisphere was under US influence, and any foreign interference would not be tolerated. Number 11. The Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839. One of the darkest chapters in American history occurred between 1838 and 1839, when thousands of Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. Known as the Trail of Tears, this brutal relocation was the result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. The act authorized the forced removal of Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, to lands west of the Mississippi River, primarily in present-day Oklahoma. Although the Cherokee people had won a landmark legal victory in Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, which recognized their sovereignty, Jackson ignored the ruling and pressed forward with the removal policy. The Trail of Tears was marked by extreme hardship as Native Americans were forced to march hundreds of miles, often on foot, through harsh weather conditions. Along the way, they faced starvation, disease, and exhaustion. It is estimated that around 4,000 Cherokee men, women, and children died during the journey. The Trail of Tears was not just a physical journey. It was a devastating cultural and emotional loss for the Native American tribes who were displaced from their homes and way of life. It symbolized the US government's policy of forced removal and its willingness to prioritize expansion over the rights and lives of indigenous peoples. The legacy of the Trail of Tears continues to resonate today as a reminder of the injustices Native Americans endured and the devastating impact of American expansion on indigenous cultures. Number 12. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. The Mexican-American War was a defining conflict in the history of the United States, one that dramatically expanded the nation's territory and fulfilled the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the US was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The war began in 1846 after the United States annexed Texas, a former Mexican territory, sparking a bitter dispute over where the border between the two nations should lie. Tensions between the United States and Mexico had been simmering since Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and was later annexed by the US in 1845. The Mexican government, however, never fully recognized Texas's independence and saw the US annexation as an act of aggression. President James K. Polk, a staunch believer in American expansion, sent troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, and when Mexican forces engaged US soldiers, Polk used the skirmish as a pretext to declare war. The war saw the United States invade Mexican territory on multiple fronts. In the West, American forces seized California and much of what is now the southwestern US through a series of military campaigns and local uprisings, such as the Bear Flag Revolt. In the East, U.S. forces under General Zachary Taylor and later Winfield Scott launched successful campaigns deep into Mexican territory, culminating in the capture of Mexico City in 1847. The war came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Under the terms of the treaty, Mexico ceded a vast portion of its northern territory, nearly half of its land, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million and assume certain claims of American citizens against Mexico. For many, the Mexican-American War remains a symbol of American ambition and expansion, but it also serves as a reminder of the costs of conquest and the complex legacy of manifest destiny. Number 13. The Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was a series of legislative measures aimed at resolving tensions between free and slave states following the acquisition of new territories after the Mexican-American War. Crafted by Senator Henry Clay, the compromise was designed to preserve the fragile Union at a time when the issue of slavery threatened to tear the nation apart. The compromise had 5 key components. First, California was admitted to the Union as a free state, upsetting the balance between free and slave states. To appease the South, the territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized with the question of slavery to be decided by popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in those regions to vote on whether to permit slavery. The compromise also included a new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens and officials in free states to assist in the capture and return of runaway slaves. Additionally, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C., and Texas was compensated for relinquishing claims to disputed territories. The Compromise of 1850 was an attempt to ease sectional tensions, but it did little to resolve the fundamental differences between North and South over the issue of slavery. The inclusion of the Fugitive Slave Act in particular inflamed abolitionist sentiment in the North, as many were outraged by the requirement to enforce slavery in free states. Though it delayed the outbreak of the Civil War, the Compromise of 1850 ultimately proved to be a temporary fix, and the deep divisions over slavery would continue to grow in the years that followed, leading to increased polarization and eventually conflict. Number 14. The Dred Scott Decision, 1857. The Dred Scott Decision of 1857 was one of the most infamous rulings in the history of the United States Supreme Court, and it played a significant role in deepening the national divide over the issue of slavery. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved African-American man who sued for his freedom after being taken by his enslaver into free territories, where slavery was prohibited. Scott's case argued that because he had lived in free territories, Illinois and Wisconsin, for several years, he should be considered a free man. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court, which delivered a devastating ruling. In a 7-2 decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. As a result, Scott had no right to sue in federal court. Taney also ruled that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery in certain territories, was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment's protection of property rights, effectively allowing slavery to expand into the Western territories. The Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves through the country. Abolitionists in the North were outraged, viewing the decision as a grave injustice and a threat to the progress they had made in restricting the spread of slavery. The ruling emboldened pro-slavery advocates in the South, who saw the decision as a validation of their right to own slaves in all U.S. territories. Far from settling the issue of slavery, The Dred Scott decision only intensified the sectional conflict. It widened the rift between North and South and hastened the onset of the Civil War as tensions over slavery and states' rights reached a breaking point. Number 15. The Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a transformative executive order that changed the course of the American Civil War and the nation's future. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Turning the war into a fight, not only for the preservation of the Union, but also for the abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was born out of necessity and principle. By mid-1862, the Civil War had dragged on longer than expected, and Lincoln realized that striking at the institution of slavery could weaken the Confederate war effort. The South's economy relied heavily on enslaved labor, and by declaring the freedom of those enslaved in Confederate territories, Lincoln aimed to disrupt this system. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, since it applied only to the Confederate states in rebellion and not to the border states or areas under Union control, it carried immense symbolic and practical significance. It also allowed formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army, adding vital manpower to the Union cause. In total, nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the Union Army and Navy by the end of the war, playing a crucial role in the Union's victory. The Emancipation Proclamation shifted the focus of the Civil War and ensured that the question of slavery would be central to the nation's future. It paved the way for the 13th Amendment, which would later abolish slavery altogether. Although it was a wartime measure, the Emancipation Proclamation marked the beginning of the end for slavery in the United States and redefined the nation's moral and political landscape. Number 16. The Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, was a turning point in the American Civil War and one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. history. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, seeking to bring the war to the North, led his army into Pennsylvania, hoping to secure a decisive victory that would force the Union to negotiate peace. However, his plans were thwarted by the Union Army under General George Meade, resulting in a brutal three-day battle. The fighting was fierce and costly, with more than 50,000 casualties on both sides. The high watermark of the battle came on the third day with Pickett's charge, a failed Confederate assault on the center of the Union line that ended in disaster for the South. The defeat forced Lee to retreat back to Virginia, marking the end of the Confederacy's invasion of the North. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the war, as it halted Lee's advance and bolstered Union morale. But the significance of Gettysburg extended beyond the battlefield. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to the site of the battle to dedicate a cemetery for the Union soldiers who had fallen there. It was during this visit that Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address, a short but powerful speech that redefined the purpose of the war. In just 272 words, Lincoln honored the sacrifice of the soldiers and reaffirmed the Union's commitment to the principles of liberty and equality, declaring that the nation must have a new birth of freedom. The Battle of Gettysburg and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address remain among the most important events in American history, symbolizing the immense sacrifice required to preserve the Union and the enduring struggle to uphold the nation's founding ideals. Number 17. The 13th Amendment, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified on December 6, 1865, was the official legal end to slavery in the United States. The amendment, which states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction, finally abolished slavery throughout the country. The passage of the 13th Amendment was a monumental step in the nation's journey toward justice and equality. Although Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had declared enslaved people free in the Confederate States, it had not abolished slavery as a legal institution across the country. The 13th Amendment closed that loophole and ensured that slavery would never be reintroduced. The struggle to pass the amendment was not easy. While it passed the Senate in April 1864, it faced significant opposition in the House of Representatives, particularly from Democrats who were either sympathetic to the South or who feared the social and economic consequences of ending slavery. It was not until January 31, 1865, after intense lobbying by Lincoln and his allies, that the amendment passed the House by a narrow margin. Lincoln viewed the passage of the 13th Amendment as essential to completing the work of the Civil War. He saw the amendment as a way to cement the Union's victory and to ensure that the sacrifices made during the war were not in vain. The 13th Amendment was a turning point in American history, abolishing an institution that had existed in the country for more than 2 centuries. It was a critical first step toward rebuilding the nation and addressing the deep racial divisions that would continue to shape the United States long after the Civil War ended. Number 18. Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, 1865. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, President Abraham Lincoln was tragically shot while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The assassination, carried out by the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, stunned the nation and plunged it into mourning at a time when the country was beginning to heal from the devastation of the Civil War. Booth, a well-known actor and fervent supporter of the Confederacy, believed that by killing Lincoln, he could strike a blow for the Southern cause and inspire the Confederacy to rise again. On that fateful night, Lincoln was watching the play Our American Cousin with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, when Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the head at point-blank range. Booth then jumped onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," before fleeing the theater. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street, where he remained in a coma for several hours before succumbing to his wounds in the early morning hours of April 15, 1865. His death marked the first time a sitting U.S. president had been assassinated, and it sent shockwaves through the nation, which had only just begun to celebrate the Union's victory in the Civil War. Booth, along with several co-conspirators, had planned to assassinate not just Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, in a coordinated effort to destabilize the federal government. While Booth succeeded in killing Lincoln, his broader plot failed. Booth was hunted down by Union soldiers and killed on April 26, 1865. Lincoln's assassination was a devastating blow to the country, which was left to grapple with the challenges of Reconstruction under his successor, Andrew Johnson. Lincoln had been the guiding force behind efforts to reunite the nation, and his death left a leadership vacuum at a critical moment in American history. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most tragic events in the nation's history, cutting short the life of a president who had led the country through its darkest hour and was poised to lead the country through the difficult task of rebuilding. Number 19. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. The Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted through most of the 1930s, was the deepest and longest-lasting economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. It began with the catastrophic stock market crash of October 1929, often referred to as Black Tuesday, when the US stock market lost nearly 90% of its value. The crash led to a wave of bank failures, business closures, and skyrocketing unemployment rates across the country, and soon spread to other parts of the world, resulting in a global economic collapse. At its peak, the unemployment rate in the United States reached an astounding 25%, with millions of Americans losing their jobs, homes, and savings. Bread lines and soup kitchens became common sights in cities and towns across the country, and many people were forced to live in makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for failing to address the crisis effectively. The causes of the Great Depression were complex and included factors such as overproduction, unequal income distribution, excessive speculation in the stock market, and weaknesses in the banking system. The effects of the Depression were felt in every sector of the economy, from agriculture to manufacturing, and the economic devastation left deep scars on the American people. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president on the promise of a New Deal for the American people. The New Deal, a series of government programs and reforms, was aimed at providing relief for the unemployed, promoting economic recovery, and preventing future depressions. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided jobs to millions of Americans, while financial reforms, such as the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, helped restore confidence in the banking system. Although the New Deal helped to stabilize the economy, it wasn't until the United States entered World War II in 1941 that the country's economy fully recovered. The war effort stimulated industrial production and reduced unemployment, ultimately bringing an end to the Great Depression. The Great Depression had a profound and lasting impact on American society and politics. It reshaped the role of the federal government, which took on a more active role in regulating the economy and providing social welfare. It also led to a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the American people, as citizens increasingly looked to the government to ensure economic stability and security. Number 20. Pearl Harbor Attack, 1941. On December 7, 1941, the United States was thrust into World War II following the surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor naval base in Hawaii by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The attack was a meticulously planned military operation intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and prevent it from interfering with Japan's expansionist ambitions in Southeast Asia. In the early morning hours, 353 Japanese aircraft, including bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, descended upon Pearl Harbor in a devastating assault. The attack lasted about 2 hours and resulted in the destruction of much of the Pacific Fleet. 8 U.S. battleships were damaged, with 4 USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS California being sunk. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and over 1,000 more were wounded in the attack. The USS Arizona remains one of the most enduring symbols of the attack, as it sank with over 1,100 crew members still aboard, becoming a watery grave and a lasting memorial to the lives lost that day. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American public and government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech, in which he called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, and just hours later, the United States formally entered World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor had far-reaching consequences. It not only led to the U.S. entry into World War II, but also marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. The attack galvanized the American public and fueled a powerful surge of patriotism. In the months and years that followed, the U.S. rapidly mobilized its industrial and military might, becoming the arsenal of democracy and turning the tide of the war. The legacy of Pearl Harbor is one of resilience and remembrance. Each year, Americans observe Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, honoring the lives lost and the bravery of those who fought back in one of the most pivotal moments in American history. Number 21. The Civil Rights Act, 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history, marking a turning point in the long struggle for racial equality. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964, the act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and ended segregation in public places, including schools, workplaces, and restaurants. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was the culmination of years of activism and protest, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and countless others who fought for equal rights during the civil rights movement. The movement had gained momentum throughout the 1950s and 1960s, with landmark events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, and the March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act was designed to address the systemic racial inequalities that had persisted since the end of slavery, particularly in the southern states, where Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and disenfranchised African Americans. The law had sweeping effects. Title II banned discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels, theaters, and restaurants, while Title VII prohibited employment discrimination, creating the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to enforce these protections. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 paved the way for further progress, including the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which addressed the disenfranchisement of black voters, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which aimed to end discrimination in housing. While the act did not end racism or inequality, it was a significant step toward building a more just and equal society and remains a cornerstone of civil rights legislation in the United States. Number 22. The Moon Landing, 1969. On July 20th, 1969, the world watched in awe as Apollo 11 astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon, marking one of the greatest achievements in the history of exploration and science. The moon landing was the culmination of years of intense effort by NASA as part of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The journey to the moon began with President John F. Kennedy's bold challenge to the nation in 1961, when he declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This ambitious goal galvanized the American space program, leading to the development of the Apollo program. Apollo 11, launched on July 16, 1969, carried astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. After a 4-day journey, the Eagle lunar module separated from the command module and descended toward the moon's surface. At 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Armstrong radioed back to Mission Control. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." 6 hours later, Armstrong made his way down the ladder and set foot on the moon, declaring, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin soon joined him, and together they spent about 2.5 hours exploring the lunar surface, collecting samples, and planting the American flag. The moon landing remains a defining moment in American and global history, symbolizing the limitless possibilities of human achievement and the drive to explore the unknown. It also paved the way for continued space exploration, with NASA's ongoing missions and the eventual focus on reaching Mars. Number 23. Roe v. Wade Decision, 1973. On January 22, 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in the case of Roe v. Wade, recognizing a woman's constitutional right to have an abortion. The court's decision was a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over reproductive rights in the United States and reshaped the national conversation about privacy and personal liberty. The case centered around Jane Roe, a pseudonym for Norma McCorvey, a woman from Texas who sought to terminate her pregnancy. At the time, Texas law prohibited abortions except when the mother's life was in danger. Roe, represented by lawyers Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, argued that the law violated her right to privacy, a principle that the Supreme Court had previously recognized in cases such as Griswold v. Connecticut. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Roe, with Justice Harry Blackmun writing the majority opinion. The court found that the constitutional right to privacy, derived from the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion. The decision effectively struck down many state laws that restricted abortion and set guidelines based on the trimester framework. During the first trimester, a woman had the absolute right to choose. During the second trimester, the state could regulate abortion to protect the health of the mother, and during the third trimester, the state could prohibit abortion, except when necessary to protect the life or health of the mother. The Roe v. Wade ruling sparked immediate controversy. Pro-choice advocates hailed it as a victory for women's rights and bodily autonomy, while pro-life activists condemned it as a violation of the sanctity of life. The decision galvanized both sides of the abortion debate, leading to decades of political and legal battles over reproductive rights. The Roe v. Wade decision remains one of the most debated and contested rulings in American history. It has faced numerous legal challenges and efforts to restrict access to abortion at the state level, and although the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in June 2022, the legacy of the original ruling continues to shape the landscape of reproductive rights in the United States. Number 24. September 11th, terrorist attacks, 2001. On September 11th, 2001, the United States faced one of the darkest days in its history when a series of coordinated terrorist attacks carried out by the extremist group Al-Qaeda claimed the lives of nearly 3,000 people and forever changed the course of American and global history. The attacks were the deadliest foreign assault on American soil and marked the beginning of a new era of security concerns and military interventions. The events of that day began at 8:46 a.m. when American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. Both towers would later collapse, sending plumes of dust and debris through the streets of Manhattan. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, causing extensive damage to the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. The final plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers heroically attempted to retake control of the aircraft from the hijackers, preventing it from reaching its intended target. The 9/11 attacks were a profound shock to the nation. President George W. Bush addressed the nation that evening, vowing to bring those responsible to justice and stating that America would not be deterred by acts of terror. The legacy of September 11th extends far beyond the initial attacks. It reshaped U.S. foreign policy, led to long and costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and altered the way Americans view national security. The events of that day continue to be remembered each year on September 11th, as the nation honors the victims and heroes who emerged from the tragedy. Number 25. The election of Barack Obama, 2008. On November 4, 2008, the United States made history by electing its first African-American president, Barack Obama. The election of Obama, a senator from Illinois, was a transformative moment in American politics and a symbol of progress in the nation's ongoing struggle for racial equality. Obama's journey to the presidency was marked by his message of hope and change. His campaign energized millions of voters, particularly young people and minority communities, and he ran on a platform focused on addressing the economic challenges posed by the Great Recession, reforming healthcare, and ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. His victory in the Democratic primary over Hillary Clinton and subsequent win over Republican candidate John McCain in the general election were testaments to his ability to build a diverse coalition of voters. Obama's election was a moment of celebration for many Americans, particularly those who had fought for civil rights and racial equality. His victory represented a significant step toward fulfilling the promise of equality that had been enshrined in the Declaration of Independence but had taken centuries to fully realize. Obama's presidency was marked by significant legislative achievements, most notably the passage of the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare, which aimed to expand access to health care for millions of Americans. He also oversaw the end of the Iraq War, the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, and efforts to combat climate change. The election of Barack Obama remains a defining moment in the nation's history, one that reflected both the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done in the ongoing fight for equality and justice. That concludes our list of 25 key moments in American history. From the first European landings to the historic election of the first African-American president, these 25 key moments remind us of the complexity and richness of American history. Each event has shaped the nation's identity, guiding its principles and its evolution. These moments also remind us that history is never static. It's an ongoing narrative of triumphs and challenges, progress and setbacks. We hope this journey through history has offered you insight into the moments that continue to influence our present and future. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more deep dives into the moments that defined our world.